I've had quite a few interesting discussions among the panelists and among our audience here. It has been a long day, we realize that. The third session is supposed to be hosted by my friend, our co-organizer, our close collaborator, Jude. And Jude is unfortunately stuck on the train coming here. It seems that traffic has been a trouble for almost all of us today. So, but we do prepared a few questions about, the ethic and policy things that side of the things that we may have experienced when we develop our early warning systems. We don't necessarily expect to seek answers that we can deal with these questions, but rather our experience with it. And on day 3, we have a specific session or whole day discussing policies and ethics side of the things and government relations. So, so today's goal is more about sharing our experience, what we see is the need that has to be improved. So the challenges that we see. If we can collect those ideas, that would be great. And if we don't have a lot of discussions among this, because not everyone works on policies and ethics, but if we do have questions, we'll collect them. If we have experience, we'll share them. And if we don't, we can just finish early and everyone can have a good rest for the long day. So let's start. I've also put the questions on the Google Doc that I shared. So if you have anything that you want to come add later after today's discussion, when you come back, when you think about it and you want to add anything, we have put the link of the Google Doc in the chat window. We can also email everyone the link to the Google Doc so that you can contribute. Make sure that you put your name on the comments so that we can interact more effectively too. If you want, if you want, closer collaborations and working with other people, it's also okay to comment anonymously if you don't really want, other people to address to your personal question or to your questions in a more close way. It's also fine. We're open to that. So yeah, it's accessible to everyone. I'm going to send a link where everyone can edit.
Yeah. And you can also put your email so we can interact with you easily, and that will be very, very good.
Yeah. And of course, it's not a mandatory thing. If you don't want to share, it's also fine. But the hope is eventually at the end of the workshop, we have a group of people who are interested in working together. So sharing your communication means would be quite helpful. So the questions that we come up, again, to warn you that I don't know a lot about these questions, but I think they're interesting questions. The first one is, what are the various ethical concerns with the early warning systems that you have been working with or you're familiar with, or any bias things or any ethical things? Or any policy limitations? Anyone from the audience?
Thanks.
Please,
can you hear me?
Yeah, please introduce yourself before you address this question.
Okay. I am Nicola. I am a medical doctor and epidemiologist. And I have this question, this observation. With respect to the general population, there are some specific populations which are more vulnerable and prone to detrimental impacts of infectious diseases and can be more impacted by infectious diseases. So the question is how to develop, let's say, an equitable early warning system that takes into account equity, inclusion, and diversity principles.
Thank you. That's interesting observation. Things things that I can think of, for example, are the homeless population, where they're quite vulnerable and they're having, limited access to the public health resources. Even in Canada, there are other people, other population groups. Do you mind to give a few more examples or elaborate on this? Sorry.
Just some examples. For example, this morning we mentioned Mpox. For example, the LGBT community has been impacted more by Mpox. So how to say integrate equity principles, how to communicate also early alert without stigmatizing, for example, this community, is, I believe, it has happened with Mpox.
Thank you.
It also HIV in the past.
Thank you. And also these, marginalized population are also really hard to reach. It's really difficult to collect data among them, so it's actually going to be a big challenge for early warning systems. Any follow-up on this, comments, follow-up questions? And again, the online audience, if you are interested, just raise your hand.
Hi, this is Tanya Phillipson. I'm a master's student at the University of Victoria. I think two things. I think with early warning systems, the more granular you get in the data and the finer the warning system, the easier it is to maybe identify, allow people to be maybe more identified than they would want to, which should be a consideration in developing the early warning system and incorporating the voices of the population who may be affected as well into the development and the identification of data, and that sort of thing needs to occur.
Thank you. So inclusion, right? In summary, get those people involved. Great. Other follow-ups or comments? Or other type of biases that you see in early warning systems? Or could be a concern that people haven't really discussed a lot?
Yeah, so I wanted to comment on the aspirations that some of the surveillance strategies that have been mentioned today. So the aspiration is that, for example, wastewater surveillance can be monitored in a way that it serves at least those who are using the water system, which again could be in other parts of the planet biased, right? And Nicola was emphasizing that, but at least there's some push for that. Although we're finding that in the U.S., places that have wastewater surveillance are places that are in counties that are more that are better off, if you will, right? But there are other disease surveillance systems that are distributed across the US, for example, that are analyzing samples of air. And we were talking with Steve earlier this morning on that. And again, the hope is that if you had a dense enough network, you could basically address some of these disparities. But it is unfortunate that our planet allocates resources according to the wealth of where you are. And so it's going to be a fact of life.
Yeah.
And we can push for a change, but
we may also need to be aware that these problems exist.
exactly.
Other comments?
I might maybe comment on that. We also need to like take care also of the global health aspects, because we are always concerned about disease because they are in the global north, but we neglect all the disease that they are already established in the global south. And when they are in the global north, we will say, oh, this is a new outbreak. This is not new outbreak. It has been there for a long time. So maybe we should like have this one health, one earth, and we should care about the disease when they arrive in any countries. And we should also develop some equity around vaccine, around caring about those diseases. So that might help advance all those issues a little bit.
Thank you. Any follow-up?
Thank you. So my name is Elda Lyson. I'm a student at University of Montreal. I have a question regard to the analysis of data from social media. I don't know how can we include those data and match the demographic of the population with using those social media with the demographic of the cases of infectious diseases. Let's say, for example, if we are collecting data from Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, we know the demographic might be maybe in a teenager and young adulthood, whereas in some infectious diseases, the demographic of the cases are more in older or younger children. How do we manage to make that variable similar so that the prediction or the results we are getting from the early warning system can be accurate?
Good observation. Any follow-ups? Well, we surely have a lot of people working with social media data here. Anyone wants to comment on this?
What was the question again? Oh, okay.
No?
Or you want to comment? Yeah.
This is Benjamin Cook, the program manager. I just had a little bit of a comment to Nicola's question, which was about EDI. And it does create what I think is a little bit of a paradox. Sometimes if you have a marginalized community that an infection hits, like should you mention the community? So for example, HIV/AIDS or monkeypox was related to LGBTQ community, and no matter what, it could just be an Aboriginal community. It doesn't matter what the minority is, but as soon as you say it's hitting that minority, people connect infection with bad, and now you've connected a specific minority to the bad outcome. But at the same time, although you might be linking a disease to a minority, this is a great way to let that minority know that this infection is is going on in their community. So, whereby something might seem unfair by mentioning the community, it's also the best defense that community has. So I find that's a little bit of a paradox, and I thought maybe that's something worth mentioning, because you could say, oh, well, just don't say it's in the gay community, just say it's spreading, but then you're ignoring a possible way to help that community, even though it will cause a negative connotation no matter what that minority group is. Anyway, that was just a thought I had about EDI in relation to this.
Interesting
Anyone want
observation.
to comment on that? Yeah, okay.
To me, it sounds like some logical mistake people have. It's not even the mistake we do when we talk about it. It's the mistake of those people who make a big estimate, big thought out of one small thing. Let's say some disease. And then everything with that community starts being bad. So this is some logical mistake, logical bias people naturally have. Yeah. But also I had some questions. We were mentioning machine learning techniques, right? As one of the instruments how we can work. Have anyone tried maybe some quantum machine learning for better algorithms to improve the algorithm itself?
Well, I guess that's a harder question. Yeah. So come back to Benjamin's question, or observation is very interesting, but
Yeah.
that shouldn't stop us from really observing the fact that some diseases might be related to some marginalized populations, because that's quite important, because some of these populations are really hard to reach, and they can serve as a reservoir where disease can spread out to the general population. So if we ignore that fact and just sample the general population, we're going to be very biased. Well, so I think on the scientific side, assigning population characteristics like age, sex, social group may not be bias. Actually, it's just association. But we might need to be careful about interpreting these results, whether we don't make people, extrapolate beyond our observation. Is more the key. Another thing that I'm actually quite interested in seeing is that there are a lot of recent efforts in social science, in citizen science, where we want to get more people involved. And there are early warning systems specifically designed for that, like PathCheck or other things where they really want to get more input from the population, right? Which is actually a big side. But there are two things. One could be very strong because we get more input and more data. And sometimes it's more biased because people who are likely to respond to the specific project may be quite biased as well. I don't know if you have any experience or any thoughts, or, oh, actually, Jude. Oh, sorry. Yeah. We're just discussing the policy session. So we want to know if, you have any observations or ideas or comments on this side of the things.
Which side?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Hello. I was just thinking that there's a great gap to be filled, and that can, be filled with this type of work. I was just thinking about one example where there was kind of a crowdsourced database with regards to COVID school exposures, where somebody took it on themselves, some parents of in British Columbia took it on themselves to capture and receive emails from parents in schools who received exposure notifications for their classroom or their school, which is a really great way to disseminate information out to anybody who's interested, because it is such a key concern for parents with children in schools. But it's also a really great source of data and a way to get people involved and I don't want to say buy-in, but yeah, people really wanting to share that information and help inform the rest of their community in a way that maybe they aren't being informed in other ways as well.
Thank you. Indeed, well, trying to get people engaged is one big challenge. I think it's a challenge that, for example, the Path Check project is facing. It's also the challenge that other, like we are looking at the ticks data to work on Lyme diseases. We have actually the same problem. There's a website that Bushra introduced to us, which is the eTicks data site, which people self-report their encounters with ticks. And that is another problem. Well, we get more exposure from the public, but it's not everyone knows about it, and it's kind of biased towards those who know. Other comments on similar things, or? Another really interesting topic, I don't know whether it's a good time to bring it up, it's data accessibility or policy. What are the impact of these things on early warning systems? Any comments on that?
Oh.
Do you mean data access to generate the early warning systems, or
the data
or ones that they have been generated?
Access data that you need to work with your system, for example.
Yeah, so that in our experience, that's the most challenging roadblock, because not everyone shares data openly and in a conducive way that we can build things. So we rely always in these larger companies like Google or Facebook or Twitter, or these and so, but so that's answering your point. But I think there's another interesting. I mean, there are two thoughts that come to mind. I was visiting Ethiopia in the Africa CDC, and there are many countries that rely on tourism to, fund their lives, right? So they basically depend on people coming to visit their places for a living. And they were wondering, when we proposed ways to build early warning systems for them, they said, who's gonna see them? And their question came from the fact that they said, imagine that you have an early warning system that has a false positive, namely that you say that there's going to be an outbreak there. And so then everyone who was interested in visiting, they cancel their trips. The whole economy of the country collapses, and then turns out that it wasn't anything, right? So there's that other perspective, that even assuming that you had a perfect early warning system, which again, the whole point of this meeting is to see how we come up with them, right? But even if you had, right, and just to push it even farther, this is more a provocation, for given that it's so late, to bring us to a reality where assume that we had the perfect early warning system, and we knew that something bad is really going to happen, right? we know from COVID that even in places where we knew that lots of people were going to be infected, it was hard to motivate people to action. But now imagine that everyone follows our recommendations and then nothing happens because, and I think somebody who was presenting, was it you, Steve, that you were quoting somebody who gets asked to predict the future, right? And so the question is, imagine you had a crystal ball that can see the future, and then you say something bad is going to happen, everyone reacts to that, and nothing happens. The question is, how will people react to that? Because they will say, well, nothing happened, but was there really something that was going to happen, or nothing happened because nothing was going to happen, right? Yeah. And so that's a course that we need to live with in terms of, you know, systems that have feedback, right? Mechanisms where you recommend something and you're changing the future, assuming that people listen to you, because a trajectory that was going to happen, it will no longer happen if people respond properly, right? So.
And that's a paradox that all of us, well, would love to face, because we want to design a system that works, and if it works, it prevents things, and
yes, but then at some point people could choose to just remove funding from it because they would say nothing is happening. So what's the purpose of these systems if we're, so nobody, it's not clear to everyone that we're averting multiple crises. Instead, nothing is happening. So they say, let's just allocate our resources somewhere else, because nothing has happened, right? Steve, did you want to say something?
Yeah, this is the problem, Steve Morse, this is the problem of public health generally, you know, the dog that doesn't bark, as it were. But the problem you mentioned actually is a source of tension for many years between WHO, for example, and national governments, because there are a number of situations, SARS is one that comes to mind just at the moment, in which, being in Toronto, in which the government, even once they knew, did not really want that information to be disseminated. And WHO had some information, but they were pretty much sworn to secrecy because they're really beholden to their member states. So that's a political issue at the global level that, you know, really does come up quite a bit, and it's even worse, I think, in the agricultural sector, where there's real money at stake. You know, but also we see this at other levels as well. You know, so with this last outbreak with SARS coronavirus 2, it's been argued that there was something known locally about it before the national government knew, but they were afraid to tell. You know, so these issues have always come up simply because this is human. Unfortunately, you know, that's a part of human nature that, you know, works against what we would like ideally to happen in the ideal world. But also, you know, in general, there is that real issue about, you know, how do you make the policymakers? I think this came up during the coffee break. How do you make this credible to policymakers, you know, who will believe essentially what they either think is in their best interest or that they think is really important? And it's not just modeling. It's right now science in the US, certainly, we've seen science and public health science and biomedical science, you know, really being undermined to some extent by certain policymakers in the past. Hopefully that will improve, because that's a very rare situation. But we have seen situations in the past where, you know, for example, during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, people would come back and be treated with great suspicion, not because they were infectious or any danger to others, but simply because there was a feeling, it was an election year, for example, and there was a feeling that something had to be shown to be done. You know, you had to show that you were doing something. The scientists considered this overreach, but the politicians felt it was necessary. Luckily, in most cases, the politicians are willing, the political decision makers, I should say, are willing to listen to the scientists, but I think we've seen a real erosion, and that means we really need to get back to the ability to communicate effectively. If I may, I'd like to bring up one question you raised during the coffee break, in fact, and that was the possibility of having something like sandboxes or experimental systems in which people, open systems in which people could test out parts of their surveillance system and parts of their data and see whether there was some commonality that people could agree on, common standards or comparisons. And I thought that sounded like a very interesting idea for moving the field.
Thank you. That's actually the idea of our co-organizer Jude at the back. We have discussed this a little bit. One of the main topic in this session is supposed to be, whether open systems versus closed systems, such as how to develop such things. Or, that's something that we're really interested in. Jude, do you want to say something about these, or?
Thank you. Thanks so much, and thanks for your presentation. Great presentation this morning. Yeah, so we have been discussing to say, if you open a system that's kind of open where everybody contributes, an open source system, are we able to advance earlier warning frameworks that we have, as opposed to the closed system that we currently have? If you decide to nationalize it, or you make it such that it's very close and it's for business purpose, like the one that we currently had in Canada here, that was providing 40% of the information to WHO, do we advance the detection of diseases, emerging and re-emerging disease, through an open system or a closed system? So we have had this conversation, and I argue that if you have a framework where if you tap into social media data, tap into news reporting, be it online from blogs, tap into Google searches, wiki searches, and you add all this data together in a framework, another person could come and say, oh, I know this data source, and the person tap into that and add to that. By so doing, we'll have multiple sources that may end up catching the signals and be able to detect an outbreak before it occurs. But if we close it, then we may not be able to identify other data sources to tap into, since we all know that the problem with our algorithm is on the data and not on the algorithm themselves. So that's the argument that we have, but it would be good to just know what others think about open system, and whether we can leave this workshop towards a point where we start building an open system where people contribute into it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any comments? Yes.
Yeah, I have one other question. This is Benjamin again. Into one of the things that people might not be looking at from, like, we look at things usually from a scientist point of view, where you're taking information from the ground up, building up that information and sending it to decision makers so that they can make decisions on that information. But sometimes it works the other way around. So for example, Benjamin Cowling from Hong Kong gave a talk last week for MFPH. It's recorded and on the site for anybody online who wants to look at it. And Benjamin Cowling talked about the zero COVID policy they had in Hong Kong, and it was very effective for the first 2 years. The disease didn't get in there. They did a very strong control on people coming into the country in a quarantine system. And what happened was, from the government side at the top end, they communicated in their science communications that they were going to continue this policy. It created apathy and a change of behavior in especially the old community, the most vulnerable. They didn't get vaccinated, and they used their system. So the science communications made them become apathetic towards the control of the disease. And when Omicron did finally get into the country, it caused a severe wave of deaths, which should not have happened because the vaccines existed. And so what I'm saying from that point of view is science communications at the top end could have saved that country from the negative outcomes that it had.
Thank you. Good observation. It's actually also sort of a battle between scientific knowledge and sometimes conflicting messages from the scientific knowledge, the community, and the other political groups' messages. So there's always a battle among them, I think.
So I appreciated, Jude, your comment on open systems versus closed systems. And one of the side effects of open systems is that if you disclose very openly to the population what you're doing and how you're monitoring anything, then you become also vulnerable to, nowadays, many people have heard about adversarial machine learning, which is a way in which you can, once you understand how to perturb a system, you could create a crisis. Like it's sort of like giving access to people to the banking system. You could fake depositing a lot of money into certain accounts, right? I mean, we don't have access, right? But in the same way, you could think of, you could flood Twitter with bots that say, I'm sick, I'm sick, I'm sick. People on searches, and people on news alerts, you create websites of news alerts that, and so on. So there's a trade-off there, right? That if you disclose all your cards, it typically works in the benefit of everyone, but it also has this potential side effect that you become openly vulnerable to. I mean, and we know that these actors exist in our communities, and anyways, sorry, just a thought.
Jude?
I want to know the difference. So ProMed work this way, where you have 30,000 volunteers around the world. They observe their communities, kind of citizen science, they send emails. And then I would like to learn how that gets verified. That's a very good point that you just raised there. So when those emails get sent, how do you verify that to ensure that the information is accurate? That's it.
No, thank you for asking. And in fact, it was a concern initially that people raised that perhaps there would be people who would put false information or try to get false information on ProMed in order to perhaps undermine a competitor or something like that. That didn't actually happen, but there were a couple of things that were done. First of all, it's a moderated listserv. And the website is moderated, which means that subject matter people, read it and put it into context. Very often the contextualization is very important, but they also try to give it a veracity check. In the early days, those few of us who were actually involved, it was kind of a hobby really more than, it was a personal operation that Jack Woodall and I and a few other people did as a labor of love. But in those days, we would simply contact people we knew through our personal networks in that region and ask them to see if they could validate or verify the information, go there themselves, and so on. Since then, ProMed has formalized something called EpiCorps, C-O-R-P-S, which essentially is asking for volunteers. And that is a double-edged sword, of course, but asking for volunteers with some appropriate biomedical or epidemiological background who would be willing to take training. It's a few hours of online training to understand how the system works and so on. And then they could be sent requests for information or other things that were unclear that needed to be verified because it wasn't clear if they were really true or not. So the concern about rumors was a very real one. It turned out initially not to be as great as we had feared, but a system was eventually developed. Now it is done with volunteers, and I think most of these are very well-meaning people who, are sincerely invested in this. There's no way, of course, to be absolutely sure. They do check out people's credentials and affiliations, and whether they have, if they're medical students or have medical degrees, or epidemiologists affiliated with an institution or whatever, and give some training, but that's about as far as it's possible to go. But so far that seems to be effective. And I think the Skoll Foundation originally funded that, so I have to give acknowledgement to Skoll and Mark Smolinski for that. But I think that really formalized something we were doing early on informally, and that might be one way to do it. I don't know how you would do it with this system. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the response. I really love the system, and I always felt that if we take, I know GIFN works almost the same way as PROMET, but for the fact that they have the WHO agents in the field verifying the information. And so if you now make the algorithm where you are integrating the data sources open without being closed, do we think that this will help us as a whole? For instance, when COVID just started in China, if we had citizens that could update the algorithm online themselves, integrate different data sources, would it have been easier for us to detect it instead of having a Chinese system that's different from our system here, but rather we move to somewhere where we have something like Python, where everybody can just invest money and update the system as a whole, integrate different data sources, improve the algorithm? Based on your experience on what you have and what we see from GIFN, combining PROMET and GIFN.
You want to? I was just going to say that when we started looking at China and the early warning signals that did show up before the outbreak in Wuhan, we first encountered the difficulty of needing to use, instead of Google searches, Bing searches, because that's what works in China, right? And then we had to use a different news aggregator that you may be aware of, right? And we had to trust the local agencies and companies for human mobility, etc. And so the notion that having an open platform is just about opening data, it has many layers of complications when you look at different countries, different habits. And so I think it's still a nice aspiration that we can discuss philosophically speaking, but in practice, it's a lot more complicated than, does that make sense?
Yeah, and it would be good if we use this data, we note these peculiarities.
Another problem is all the storage of the data. So even if we share all the algorithm and everything, there are we need like a space to share also all the text. For example, for GIFN, are doing like newspapers, so it takes like space. So we need all those information, and we need also a way to weight all the data sources. Like for GIFN, you said all those noisy data coming from social media, they might have like a very small weight, and then you progress and maybe have a big weight for very sincere data. So there are a lot of difficulties to bring all the data together and develop like a very concrete and very strong early warning system. But I don't feel like sharing all the platform will help a lot on the development. Maybe sharing among researcher or among group of researcher all like the results and how we are doing it, and so we'll advance the early warning system, but I don't feel like open access will help.
Turns out that, oh, sorry.
Dave Carter again. Dongmei and I were having a conversation during the break, and I think this might push us in a different direction. So the assumption on this discussion is, how do we get all the data into one place so that we can all do cool things with it? Libraries, especially academic libraries, have had this problem for decades and are farther ahead of us. And the observation there is that there's no central repository for academic data. Every institution has its own, and what they've defined instead is interchange standards. So they've said, here is the minimum amount of information you need to be able to represent, in their case, documents, theses and stuff like that, to get stuff done. And here is a standardized way of trading that data back and forth. This also kind of combats the not invented here syndrome that we get from funders and other organizations. So thinking specifically about the GFIN example, imagine we had a standard way to get data out that was sufficiently anonymous and sufficiently respectful of the Dow Jones Factiva license, but sufficient for feeding research needs. So that could look like triples of relevant keywords plus date plus a location mention. Would that, if we could standardize that intercommunication in a way, that is an interesting signal that can support a lot of research, and you can imagine a lot of different early warning systems could output that in a standardized and still anonymized way. So maybe that's, I don't know if that's a different discussion, but.
No, I think it's quite related because as I wanted to comment that, software engineering has faced the same problem long before us are discussing this, and they have the closed source open development models, and they have multiple levels of openness, right? We have like Python and R, for example, where people really develop open source. We also have open frameworks where the components can be closed, but we have open interface where people can interact with each other. So there are different levels of things, openness. And we have Expedia, for example, representing open data, which doesn't necessarily mean that the algorithm or anything is open. So, well, they are, but it doesn't mean that it has to be open. So there are different levels of openness. It's the interesting thing is what actually would help us to move forward in the future. Jude?
Just get to know more about what GFIN and PROMIT has done and the open, if we look at open data sources. When I look at the model of PROMIT and GFIN, I've always been wondering, how do they capture marginalized communities? So I don't know if this can get into, if we move towards an open system, how do we ensure that marginalized community, data from marginalized communities being captured into this? So just wanted to learn from that as we integrate and build towards novel early warning systems.
Thank you. Openness also means that including open access to more broader population. Stephen.
Thank you. The field may have moved far ahead of this, but I think one suggestion that I think I hear coming out of this is to have some sort of test data set that people can use, as well as data interchangeability, which would be a great idea to have perhaps a test set at a number of different levels that people can standardize on and test their systems with. I don't know if that would be useful to the field or not, but at least it might be a starting place for some people, at least those who are not highly experienced, certainly those entering the field. Probably many of you and many of the people on this at this conference are already way beyond needing that, but it might help to be able to try out new things at a fairly low cost. The census does that in the US, but it's not all that accessibly designed. The user interface isn't that easy.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's an interesting suggestion. Comments, follow-ups? We don't have. You might want to start again so that the online audience can
No,
hear you.
Ben was raising a very good question. If we look at places where certain diseases have emerged in those communities, when we look at new ways of collecting that or ways of collecting data, be it social media, be it even news reporting or wastewater, these communities do not have these data. How do we get towards getting data from these communities?
So specifically with African countries, the conversations I've had with local people there are that cultural practices differ from country to country, and they use very different platforms to communicate, including sometimes when they don't have a smartphone, but they may have a phone, right? And what I've heard is that, for example, monitoring radio stations where people actually, it's like what the barber shop is for certain communities, there is calling the local radio channel to say, we saw this, what should we do? And they say, well, call this doctor or go see this person, right? And so that what I'm suggesting is that different sensors need to be conceived for different regions and localities, depending on what's the habitual way to deal with, say, an outbreak, right? And maybe the person who's in the pharmacy, I know I've been in regions in Mexico, for example, where there are no doctors in certain communities, but you can go to the pharmacy, the local pharmacy, and the pharmacist tells you, why don't you try this, right? And so there, it would make sense to have the ProMed expert be the pharmacist, and maybe the ProMed expert in the other communities could be the radio host saying, you know, I received 10 calls yesterday about this. It's not normal, right? And so that's your anomaly detector there. So anyways, I don't know if I added to what you were saying. I think, okay. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Other comments?
Yeah, I was like just about to say it's more about community-based research, and we need like to engage them in the research instead of doing research ourselves and not involving the community. So we don't understand the way they communicate. We don't understand the way they do, like they manage the outbreak. So we need really to go and see and learn and engage them in every step of research, so we can build something that responds to what they have been facing. We cannot just like do the research as outsider and hope that we will get some results over there. So yeah.
So my name is Lovelyn. I'm from Dow University. So adding to what she said, I think that we can start incorporating those other departments like the journalists when we are trying to do the research, because those people are the people getting the information from the people in the community, at least if they can be giving us the right and the correct information, because we know what happened during COVID. We had a lot of fake news and that were published from maybe from the journalists or social media. Yeah, so I think if we can collaborate and incorporate journalists and other, even the health, the policymakers, which are the key people in this early warning system, because if we, the researchers, go ahead and find out what we are going to do, so how are we going to convince them to implement it if we don't include them while we are doing the research, like while we are deciding in our findings? So if we don't include them early, so it will be a problem for them to implement our findings. So I think in future we should be incorporating those people. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I really hate to say this, but this is already 4:45. We have already had a 1-hour discussion on this session. I mean, my brain doesn't work. I'm sure that it has been a long day for everyone, but it has been excellent discussion among the panelists and among ourselves. I really appreciate everyone's effort into this. Thank you very much. And tomorrow we're going to have the same schedule, 3 talks, and well, actually, we have 4 panelists. The 3 talks are from, did I have the schedule? Yeah, so the 3 talks are from Mark Lipschitz and Carmen Khan and Ali Asgaran. Then in the afternoon, we have 2 discussion sessions. 2 of the panelists are actually experts